Around 9 o'clock in the morning on April 23, 1994, the spring air in Tokyo felt crisp and full of the scent of cherry blossoms. A park cleaner moved slowly through Inokashira Park, swinging a long pair of metal tongs to pick up stray wrappers and discarded cans near a trash bin. He noticed a black plastic bag tucked deep inside, heavier than the usual picnic waste, and decided to pull it out to see if it needed a separate disposal. Tonight we are going into a world where reality is more clinical than any fiction, starting with a case that left a city paralyzed by its own shadow. There are 11 stories in this collection, and as the rain taps against your window, I want you to settle in and just listen. If you find these tales of the strange and the dark compelling, please subscribe and let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. As for the like button, treat it like a perfectly measured architectural blueprint that you just found in the middle of a forest. Do not question why it is there or who drew it, just give it a polite nod and press it firmly before walking away. Now, make sure your doors are locked, turn down the lights, and let the white noise take over as we step into the quiet, orderly life of a man who was about to be reduced to a series of perfect measurements. Seiichi Kawamura was a 35-year-old architect who viewed the world through a lens of symmetry and structural integrity. He lived in a modest apartment in Mitaka, a suburb known for its greenery and the sprawling park where families spent their weekends. His daily routine was a clockwork sequence of early morning coffee, long hours at the drafting table, and a quiet commute back to a home that smelled of wood polish and fresh tea. On the evening of April 21st, Seiichi packed his leather briefcase with the same care he applied to his blueprints, ensuring every pen was in its place. He told his colleagues he was heading home, his voice steady and unremarkable, as he stepped out into the humid Tokyo twilight. Friends described him as a man who avoided conflict, someone who preferred the predictable logic of a building's frame to the messy unpredictability of human emotion. His wife expected him by 7, the usual time the door would click open, and his shoes would be placed neatly in the entryway. She had prepared a simple dinner, the steam from the rice cooker filling the small kitchen with a sense of domestic safety that had never been challenged. But as the clock ticked past 8 and then 9, the silence in the apartment began to feel heavy, like a structure slowly losing its balance. Seiichi was not a man of mystery or hidden vices, and his social circle was as limited as his professional one was vast. He didn't have a history of late nights at the izakaya or long strolls without a destination in mind. Every minute of his life was accounted for in a planner that sat on his desk, making the empty seat at the dinner table look like a glaring error in a complex mathematical equation. The next morning, his wife visited the local police station, her hands trembling as she handed over a photograph of a man with a gentle, unremarkable face. The officers were polite but unimpressed, suggesting that perhaps he had simply needed a night away from the pressure of his high-stakes architectural projects. They didn't see a victim. They saw one of the thousands of salarymen who occasionally disappear into the neon lights of the city. By the afternoon of April 22nd, the apartment had become a cage of ticking clocks and unanswered phone calls. Seiichi's wife sat by the window watching the commuters return home, searching for the specific gait and posture of her husband among the sea of dark suits. Every time the elevator chimed in the hallway, her heart would spike, only to settle into a dull, aching thud when the footsteps passed her door. Sometimes the most terrifying thing about a life well-ordered is how easily it can be dismantled when the wrong person starts pulling at the threads. Seiichi had spent his career building things meant to last for decades, never realizing that his own physical form was far more fragile than the steel and glass he admired. He was a man of plans, now trapped in a situation that followed a logic he could never have designed. While the police were filing the initial paperwork for a missing person, the park cleaner back at Inokashira was struggling with that heavy black bag. He managed to tear a small hole in the plastic, expecting to find wet food scraps or perhaps a discarded car part. Instead, a pale, cold object slid toward the opening, and he realized he was looking at a human ankle, severed with a precision that looked almost manufactured. Within the hour, the park was cordoned off with yellow tape that fluttered in the breeze, contrasting sharply with the peaceful cherry blossoms. Forensic teams in white suits began a systematic search of every trash can in the area, their movements slow and deliberate. By midday, they had moved from the first bin to the 13th, and the tally of plastic bags began to climb, each one containing a horrifyingly similar cargo. When the bags were lined up in the morgue, the lead investigator felt a chill that had nothing to do with the refrigerated air. There were 27 pieces in total, each one wrapped carefully in 2 layers of plastic, some translucent and some black. As the medical examiner began to lay the parts out on a steel table, he realized that the killer hadn't just cut the body, he had processed it. Every single piece of flesh and bone was exactly 20 centimeters long, measured with a consistency that defied the messy reality of human anatomy. The cuts didn't show the jagged marks of a struggle or the hesitant hacking of an amateur, but the smooth, clean lines of a professional. It was as if the killer had used a laser or a high-speed industrial saw to ensure that every segment was uniform in size and shape. You stand over the table and notice that there is no blood, not a single drop staining the plastic or the skin of the victim. The killer had somehow drained every pint of fluid from the body before the first cut was made a task that requires extensive knowledge of the circulatory system. The skin itself looked scrubbed, almost polished, as if it had been washed with industrial solvents to remove any trace of the person who had held these limbs. Most disturbingly, when the technicians tried to take fingerprints from the severed hands, they found that the ridges of the skin had been meticulously sanded down. The killer hadn't just hidden the body, he had attempted to delete the victim's identity from the physical world. It took days of comparing dental records and searching for unique bone structures before the police could confirm that these 27 pieces used to be Seiichi Kawamura. The investigation then turned to the park itself, a place where hundreds of people passed through every single day. The trash cans were emptied every morning, meaning the killer had to have disposed of the bags in the dead of night, moving between 13 different locations. Yet in a city as crowded as Tokyo, not a single witness reported seeing a man carrying heavy dripping bags through the dark forest of the park. As detectives mapped out the crime scene, they realized the most chilling detail of all was the size of the trash can openings. Each bin had a narrow, rectangular slot designed to prevent people from dumping large bags of household waste. When they measured the width of those slots, they found they were exactly 20 centimeters wide, the same length as every single piece of Seiichi's body. The killer hadn't chosen a random length for his grisly work. He had measured the disposal site before he even committed the crime. This wasn't an act of passion or a sudden outburst of violence, but a planned architectural project where the human body was just another material to be fitted into a space. The level of premeditation suggested someone who operated with the cold, unfeeling logic of a machine. The search for the remaining parts of Seiichi grew desperate as the head, the torso, and the genitals were still missing. Divers searched the park's pond and canine units combed the surrounding woods, but the core of the man had simply vanished. It was as if the killer wanted to prove that he could take the most important parts of a human being and make them disappear forever, leaving only the limbs as a taunt. The lead detective stared at the empty space on the autopsy table where the chest should have been and thought that some people don't just kill, they erase. I believe he felt a sudden, sharp realization that he wasn't looking for a typical criminal, but someone who viewed life as a puzzle to be taken apart and discarded in pieces. The absence of the head meant there was no face to look at, no eyes to plead for justice. Forensic experts concluded that the precision of the cuts and the complete drainage of blood could only be achieved by someone with a background in surgery or professional butchery. The bags were tied with a complex fisherman's knot, a specific variation used by deep-sea trawlers that requires significant strength to tighten. This pointed to a perpetrator who was not only highly educated but possessed a physical skill set that was rare in the heart of Tokyo. Despite interviewing over 2,000 people and checking every medical and meat processing facility in the region, the trail went cold. The sheer lack of a motive was the biggest obstacle, as Seiichi had no connection to any underworld figures or secret societies. The killer had chosen him like a specimen, a random set of coordinates in a city of millions, and executed a perfect clinical disappearance that defied every standard investigative technique. In March of 1995, a major domestic terror attack involving sarin gas diverted all police resources away from the Inokashira case, allowing the files to gather dust. By the time the investigation resumed, the trail was frozen, and the statute of limitations for the murder officially expired in the year 2009. As of April 2026, the case remains officially unsolved, and the person who measured those trash cans has never been identified. The quiet park in Tokyo returned to its peaceful state, but the memory of those 27 bags remains a scar on the city's history. From the calculated silence of a Japanese garden, we move now to the high-speed shadows of a German motorway, where another man was found packed away in a container of luxury. The distance between Tokyo and Munich is vast, but the darkness that connects them is exactly the same. On a bright Tuesday afternoon in May 1995, the Ismaning parking lot along the A96 motorway was a transit point for travelers. A hiker decided to stretch his legs away from the hum of the German traffic, moving toward a patch of pine trees that bordered the asphalt. The air smelled of warm pine needles and diesel exhaust, a common mix for the Bavarian countryside. As he stepped over a low ridge, he spotted something that didn't belong among the dry needles and discarded soda cans. A high-quality leather trunk sat upright in the shade, looking like it had been misplaced by a traveler in a great hurry. It was a deep, rich brown with brass fittings that caught the small glints of sunlight filtering through the canopy. There were no luggage tags, no scuff marks from a long journey, and no indication of who might have left such an expensive item in the middle of the woods. The hiker felt a strange pull of curiosity mixed with a sudden, unexplainable sense of dread that kept him from touching it. Luxury is a loud signature until someone decides to silence it. This trunk was not something bought at a local department store. It was a piece of craftsmanship designed for someone who valued status and durability. In the world of high-end travel, a bag like this is a quiet signal of wealth, a way to tell the world you belong in first-class lounges and five-star hotels. But here, under the shadows of the Ismaning pines, it looked like a coffin that had been polished to a mirror finish. To understand the man inside that trunk, the investigators had to look at the life he had built for himself before the execution. He was a man who clearly appreciated the finer things, a man whose wardrobe suggested a life spent in the boardrooms of Milan or the private clubs of Zurich. He moved through the world with the confidence of someone who never had to check the price tag, his movements draped in the finest wool and silk that money could buy. His days likely began in expensive hotel suites where the sheets were pressed and the coffee was served on silver trays. He was a man of appointments and hushed conversations, someone who understood the value of discretion in high-stakes environments. There was a precision to his appearance, from the way his hair was trimmed to the perfect shine on his hand-stitched leather shoes. He was a person who left a specific curated impression on everyone he met, yet managed to remain entirely anonymous. He likely walked through the busy airports of Europe with a focused stride, his presence commanding respect without him ever having to raise his voice. He was the kind of man people noticed, but didn't dare to question a ghost in a designer suit who existed in the transition spaces of the wealthy. His life was a series of luxury cabins and leather-bound journals, a world where the borders of countries were just lines on a map to be crossed for the right price. The attention to detail in his lifestyle was obsessive, almost clinical in its execution. Every shirt was tailored to his exact measurements, and every accessory was chosen to complement a persona of quiet power. He was a man who understood that in his world a single loose thread could be the beginning of an unraveling. He lived in a social vacuum, a place where professional relationships were built on mutual benefit rather than personal connection or shared history. Beneath the surface of this polished life, there must have been a constant, low-level tension. A man who moves through the world with such deliberate anonymity is usually running from something or toward a goal that requires total secrecy. He was a specialist in being nobody while looking like somebody, a paradox that allowed him to operate in the shadows of the elite. This was a man who knew the cost of failure and the price of silence in the cold business of international shadows. The hiker eventually called the authorities, unable to shake the feeling that the trunk was too heavy for its size. When the first responding officer arrived, he knelt in the dirt, the smell of high-grade leather hitting his nose mixed with a faint metallic scent. He noticed that the trunk hadn't been dragged. It had been carried and placed with an eerie level of care. There were no footprints in the soft earth, suggesting the person who left it was as careful as the man who owned it. When the lid was finally pried open, the investigators didn't find the gold or cash they had expected. Instead, they found a man in his late 30s, curled into a fetal position as if he were trying to sleep in a space far too small for him. He was dressed in a charcoal gray Italian suit that looked like it had never seen a wrinkle. His hands were folded neatly across his chest, and his eyes were closed, giving him the appearance of a museum exhibit rather than a victim of violence. The lead investigator leaned in closer, his breath hitching as he noticed the two small clean holes at the base of the man's skull. There was almost no blood, a sign that the execution had been carried out with professional efficiency elsewhere before the body was transported. The victim looked pristine, his skin pale and cool to the touch, like a marble statue that had been tucked away for safekeeping. It was a scene of clinical finality that left the seasoned detectives in a state of stunned silence. As they began the process of identifying the body, the police encountered a series of obstacles that made no sense. They started with the clothing, expecting to trace the luxury brands back to a specific boutique or a credit card transaction. But as they turned the collars and checked the waistbands, they found that every single label had been meticulously cut out. Not a single stitch of branding remained to tell them where the suit, the shirt, or even the silk tie had been purchased. The removal of the labels was done with a steady hand, likely using a surgical scalpel. It wasn't just about hiding the brand. It was about stripping the man of any geographical or commercial origin. He was a blank slate in a designer frame, a man whose very existence had been scrubbed of context. The investigator felt a wave of frustration, realizing that the killer hadn't just taken the man's life, but had attempted to delete his entire history from the physical world. I think a man this wealthy shouldn't be this invisible, yet here he was, a masterpiece of anonymity. The detectives turned their attention to his shoes, which were of such high quality they had to be bespoke. They were hand-stitched with a unique pattern that suggested a master cobbler in either London or Florence. They spent weeks contacting every high-end shoe manufacturer in Europe, showing photographs of the stitching, but every lead ended in a polite shrug and a closed door. The victim's physical condition told a story of a life lived at the highest levels of society. His hands were soft with no signs of manual labor, and his fingernails were perfectly manicured. He was in excellent health, with a physique that suggested a regular fitness routine and a diet of high-quality food. He was a man who took care of himself, a man who expected to live a long and prosperous life until the moment those two bullets changed everything. The forensic team then turned to the victim's dental work, which proved to be the most significant clue they would ever find. He had an expensive bridge made of high-quality gold and ceramic, a level of dental care that was rare even among the wealthy in Germany. The materials and the specific technique used to set the crowns pointed directly to elite clinics in Eastern Europe, most likely in Russia or perhaps Hungary. It was a signature of the post-Cold War elite. This dental work was a map of a world that was rapidly changing in the mid-90s. It suggested the victim was part of the new wave of Eastern European power players who were flooding into the West with deep pockets and dark connections. He was someone who could afford the best medical care in a region where such things were a luxury for the few. Yet despite sending the dental records to every major clinic in Moscow and Budapest, no name was ever attached to the gold. The caliber used in the execution was 7.65 millimeter, a small, quiet round that was the preferred choice for professional hitmen in the Eastern Bloc. It was a round designed for close-range work, intended to be discreet and effective without the mess of a larger weapon. The lack of defensive wounds or any sign of a struggle suggested that the man in the trunk never saw it coming. He had been liquidated by someone he likely trusted, or at least someone he didn't fear. The trunk itself was a high-end model manufactured in a small quantity and sold through exclusive retailers. The police managed to trace the batch number to a shipment sent to a boutique in Paris, but the trail went cold there. The store had no record of the specific sale, which was common for high-cash transactions involving the international elite. Every piece of physical evidence was a dead end, a series of clues that led back to a void of information. The German authorities worked with Interpol to check the man's fingerprints against every database in Europe, North America, and Russia. The results were always the same, no match. It was as if he had never been arrested, never served in a military, and never held a government job that required biometric records. He was a ghost with a bank account's worth of fashion on his back, a man who had successfully lived outside the system until the system decided to erase him. As the months turned into years, the case of the man in the trunk became a legend among Bavarian detectives. They theorized he was a high-level courier, or perhaps a cleaner for the Russian mafia, someone who moved money and secrets across the invisible borders of Europe. His execution was likely a business decision, a way to settle a debt or silence a potential witness before he could speak to the wrong people. He was a casualty of the lawless Wild East era. The victim was eventually buried in an anonymous grave in a quiet cemetery near Munich. There was no headstone, only a small marker with a case number and the date he was found. No one ever came to leave flowers, and no one ever called the police to ask if they had found a missing businessman from the East. He remained as silent in death as he had been in the final moments of his life, a secret kept by the pine trees of Ismaning. In the year 2026, the Bavarian State Police re-entered the victim's DNA into a new international database as part of the Identify Me project. Despite the leaps in forensic technology and the rise of genetic genealogy, there have still been 0 hits. The man in the trunk remains one of Europe's most enduring mysteries, a professional ghost whose true identity was cut away along with the labels on his suit. The file stays open, but the pages are yellowing with age. As of today, the case is classified as an unsolved murder, a cold case that serves as a reminder of the shadows that stretch across the European continent. The trunk is kept in a police evidence locker, its leather still supple, its brass still shining, waiting for a name that may never come. Some people are born to be forgotten, while others are meticulously unmade by those who know exactly how to disappear. The silence of that German forest is heavy with the weight of things unsaid, a stillness that carries over across the borders of the East. We leave the motorway now and head toward the rugged, mist-covered mountains of Romania, where the darkness takes a different, more ancient shape. In a village called Vadu Lat, the air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, and a fear that isn't clinical at all, but born of a sweetness that turned into a nightmare. In the winter of 1995, the village of Vadu Lat sat like a forgotten stone in the middle of the Romanian countryside. The wind howled through the bare branches of the plum trees, carrying a biting frost that turned the mud of the unpaved roads into iron. Inside her small timber frame house, Elena G., a 62-year-old grandmother, sat by the wood stove, watching the orange glow dance across the walls. Elena was a woman of quiet habits and deep roots, having spent nearly every day of her life within the same 10-mile radius. Her world was measured in the cycles of the heart roost and the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that stood in the hallway. She lived alone since her husband had passed, but her house was never truly empty, always smelling of dried herbs, wood smoke, and the sweet, heavy scent of linden honey. Every morning she followed a routine that had been etched into her bones over decades of labor. She would wrap a thick wool shawl around her shoulders, step out into the crisp air, and check on her beehives at the edge of the garden. The bees were dormant in the cold, but she spoke to them anyway, her voice a soft murmur against the silence of the frost. To Elena, the hives were a living legacy of a family that had once filled this home. The pantry was her pride and joy, a cool, dark room lined with oak shelves that groaned under the weight of glass jars. She spent her summers preserving the fruits of the land, turning plums into thick jam and honey into a golden currency for the winter months. She knew the placement of every jar by touch, a mental map of sustenance that gave her a sense of control in a world that was rapidly changing outside the village. On the morning of December 14th, the smoke from Elena's chimney did not rise to meet the gray sky. A neighbor named Mihai noticed the lack of movement and felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the Romanian winter. He walked up the path, his boots crunching on the frozen earth, and knocked on the heavy wooden door. When there was no answer, he pushed it open, finding the interior of the house strangely warm and eerily still. Mihai moved through the kitchen, calling Elena's name, but the only sound was the faint whistle of the wind through the eaves. He stepped into the bedroom and saw Elena lying on her bed, her covers pulled up to her chin, as if she were merely resting. But as he drew closer, he saw the unnatural stillness of her face and the way the lamplight reflected off a dark, wet stain that had seeped into the white lace of her pillowcase. The local police arrived hours later, their boots tracking mud onto the clean wooden floors that Elena had scrubbed just the day before. They found the elderly woman had been precisely opened from the sternum to the navel, a single clean incision that showed no signs of hesitation. There was very little blood on the floor, suggesting the killer had used surgical techniques to contain the mess while they performed their grim task inside the room. A young detective from the city named Stefan stood over the body, his brow furrowed as he looked at the empty cavity where Elena's heart should have been. He had seen his share of violence in the post-communist chaos of the 90s, but this was something different. It wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. It was a clinical extraction. The killer had worked with a steady hand, ignoring the gold wedding ring still on Elena's finger. Outside the house, a crowd of villagers had gathered, their faces pale with a terror that was centuries old. Whispers of the strigoi, the restless dead of Romanian folklore, began to spread like wildfire through the cold air. They spoke of ancient curses and shadows that drank the life from the living, their eyes darting toward the dark woods that ringed the village. To them, the surgical precision of the wound was not a sign of a man, but of a monster. Fear is a parasite that feeds on the absence of a logical explanation. Stefan watched as the villagers began to cross themselves and pull their coats tighter, realizing that he was fighting two enemies, a killer and a legend. He ordered a full search of the property, looking for any physical trace that would prove a human had been there. He found no forced entry, no muddy footprints, and no fingerprints on the polished surfaces of the furniture. The investigation moved to the cellar, where the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rot. Stefan found a small window that had been left slightly ajar, just wide enough for a slender person to slip through. On the sill, he noticed a tiny smear of white powder that looked like talc, the kind used inside surgical gloves. This was his first real proof that they were looking for someone with medical training, not a ghost from a fairy tale. 3 days into the search, Stefan returned to the pantry to re-examine the shelves for any signs of theft. He ran his hand along the rows of honey jars, his fingers tracing the cold glass until he reached a jar that felt different from the others. The lid was slightly sticky, and the honey inside was darker, with a strange heavy object suspended in the golden liquid. He carried the jar into the light of the kitchen, his breath catching in his throat. I wonder if the killer wanted to preserve her heart in the only sweetness she had left. As the golden honey swirled inside the glass, the unmistakable shape of a human heart settled at the bottom, perfectly preserved by the natural sugars. The sight was so jarringly beautiful and horrifying that Stefan had to set the jar down on the table to keep his hands from shaking. The killer hadn't taken the organ as a trophy, they had put it back. The focus of the investigation shifted to a local man who had once been a veterinarian in a neighboring district. He was a recluse who lived on the edge of the woods and had been dismissed years earlier for erratic behavior during surgeries. When the police searched his cabin, they found a set of high-quality scalpels and a collection of medical textbooks on the preservation of organic tissue. But the man himself had vanished into the mountains. The case was never officially solved, as the veterinarian was never found and no physical evidence directly linked him to the scene of the crime. Under pressure from local leaders who feared a mass exodus of terrified villagers, the police closed the file as a robbery gone wrong, despite the fact that nothing of value had been taken from the house. They preferred a lie that people could forget over a truth that would keep them awake at night. As of April 2026, the mystery of Vadu Lat remains a dark chapter in the archives of the Romanian Ministry of Interior. Most of the original forensic evidence was lost during the bureaucratic reshuffling of the late 90s, and the house where Elena G. lived has long since collapsed into the earth. The honey killer has become a cautionary tale told to children in the region, a shadow that exists between science and superstition. The silence of that Romanian village is a heavy, suffocating thing, much like the air inside a sealed industrial tank. We move now from the ancient fears of the countryside to the cold metallic reality of a factory in Taiwan. In the district of Guishan, 3 men would walk into a space that was supposed to be empty, only to find that the laws of physics and the boundaries of human presence were about to be rewritten in the dark. Early morning in January 1996, the Guishan district of Taoyuan was a landscape of gray concrete and humming electrical grids. Three men, Lin Chen and Wang, made their way through the factory gates, their breath misting in the cold, damp air of northern Taiwan. They were a tight-knit crew, bonded by years of 12-hour shifts, and the shared ambition of providing for families they rarely saw in the daylight. Lin was the eldest at 34, a man whose life was a series of carefully managed responsibilities. He carried a small dented metal lunchbox that his wife packed every morning with rice and pickled greens. His movements were slow and deliberate, the result of a decade spent navigating the hazardous corners of the chemical plant. He was the one who kept the younger men focused when the fatigue of the night shift began to set in. Chen, 28, was the optimist of the group, constantly talking about the small apartment he was saving to buy for his new bride. He wore a red string around his wrist for good luck, a gift from his mother that he never took off even when reaching deep into the machinery. He was a man of plans and lists his pockets always stuffed with sketches of furniture and calculations of interest rates that represented his future. The youngest was Wang, a 22-year-old apprentice who had only been with the company for 6 months. He was eager to prove himself, often volunteering for the dirtiest jobs to earn the respect of the veterans. Wang thought about the train ticket in his pocket, a small slip of paper that promised a new beginning far away from the factory walls during the upcoming holiday. He was the last one to punch the time clock that morning, his signature a quick, messy scrawl. The task for the day was routine, a scheduled maintenance check on a decommissioned storage vat at the far end of the industrial complex. The tank was a massive cylinder of reinforced steel, standing 20 feet tall and capable of holding thousands of gallons of volatile fluids. It had been drained and ventilated for a week, leaving only a thin, non-corrosive residue of cleaning agents at the very bottom of its dark, hollow belly. Their supervisor, a man named Mr. Shea, watched from a distance as the three men gathered their equipment near the base of the tank. They had a single industrial flashlight, a set of scrubbing brushes, and 3 pairs of heavy rubber boots designed to withstand chemical exposure. Shea noted that the men seemed in good spirits, joking about the smell of the tank as they prepared to ascend the narrow metal ladder to the top. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Shea saw Lin reach the summit of the tank and wave a hand before disappearing through the circular hatch. Chen followed immediately after, then Wang, his bright yellow hard hat the last thing visible before the lid was lowered. The procedure required the lid to be loosely set to keep the internal temperature stable, a standard safety measure they had performed dozens of times without incident. Industrial silence is a specific type of heavy, a weight that presses against the ears when the machines finally stop and only the wind remains. As the morning progressed, the factory floor hummed with its usual mechanical rhythm, but the area around the storage tank remained eerily still. No voices echoed from within the steel walls, and no tools clattered against the metal floor, a lack of sound that Hashi initially attributed to the depth of the vat. By noon, the 3 men had not emerged for their scheduled lunch break, which was uncharacteristic for Lin, who never missed a meal. "Mr." Heisei walked over to the tank, his boots echoing on the concrete, and called out their names toward the top. There was no response, only the faint metallic ring of his own voice bouncing off the storage containers. He climbed the ladder, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts as he reached the upper platform. You stand at the top of the ladder, the cold metal biting into your palms as you peer into the darkness of the vat. The circular hatch is not loosely set as it should be, but is instead firmly shut, and the external locking mechanism has been engaged from the outside. You feel a sudden hollow sensation in your chest as you realize that someone or something has sealed 3 men inside a windowless steel tomb while they were working. With a frantic effort, Heisei threw the latch and pulled back the heavy lid, expecting to hear the panicked shouts of the men or the smell of stagnant air. Instead, a wall of absolute silence rose from the opening, cooler and cleaner than the air on the factory floor. He shone his flashlight down into the depths, the beam cutting through the darkness until it hit the circular floor 20 feet below, illuminating a sight that defied any logical explanation. 3 pairs of heavy rubber boots stood neatly in the center of the tank, arranged as if the men had simply stepped out of them and walked through the steel walls. Next to the boots lay the industrial flashlight, its beam still cutting a bright dying arc across the floor of the vat. There were no bodies, no blood, and no signs of a struggle, just the abandoned tools of a job that had been interrupted by a vanishing act. The local police arrived within the hour, followed by a team of industrial engineers who began a systematic teardown of the tank's structure. They searched for hidden drainage pipes, secret hatches, or any structural flaw that would allow 3 grown men to leave a locked container. They found nothing but solid steel and reinforced concrete, a sealed environment that offered no exit large enough for even a small child to pass through. The residue at the bottom of the tank was tested and confirmed to be a non-corrosive cleaning agent, ruling out the possibility that the men had been dissolved. Every inch of the factory floor was scoured, and security footage from the main gates was reviewed minute by minute, but it showed no one leaving the premises. The 3 workers had entered the area under the watchful eye of their supervisor and had simply ceased to exist within the span of 2 hours. Investigators focused on the locking mechanism of the hatch, which could only be operated by someone standing on the outside platform. This led to the theory that the men had been murdered and their bodies smuggled out in chemical drums, but the timeline made such a feat impossible. To move 3 bodies, clean the tank, and escape the facility unnoticed would have required a team of professionals and a level of coordination the factory staff lacked. Rumors began to circulate among the local workers about a staged disappearance, suggesting the men had fled together to escape mounting gambling debts. But the police found their bank accounts untouched, and the train ticket in Wang's pocket was still lying inside his jumpsuits, which were found folded near the boots. Men who are running away do not leave behind their shoes, their money, or the very clothes on their backs. The factory owners were eventually investigated for labor violations, but no evidence was found linking the company to the disappearance of the 3 employees. The case became a source of terror for the local community, with many families refusing to let their sons work in the industrial district of Guishan. The idea of a locked room vanishing in a high-tech facility was a nightmare that no amount of industrial safety training could ever prepare for. By the late 90s, the investigation had officially stalled, leaving the families of Lin Chen and Wang in a state of permanent, agonizing limbo. They held vigils at the factory gates every year, placing incense and fruit near the base of the tank where their loved ones were last seen. The empty boots remained in a police evidence locker, a haunting physical reminder of 3 lives that ended in a place where no one should have been able to leave. As of April 2026, the chemical plant has been completely demolished to make way for a new high-speed rail terminal and a modern warehouse complex. The massive steel vat was cut into pieces and melted down decades ago, taking whatever secrets it held into the furnace. No forensic trace was ever recovered from the site during the demolition, and the 3 men remain listed as missing persons in the Taoyuan police archives. The families have mostly moved away, but the legend of the flying trio persists in the folklore of Taiwan's industrial heartland. It serves as a cold reminder that even in a world governed by machines and schedules, there are gaps in the physical world that can swallow a person whole. The mystery of Guishan is a story of a locked door that opened to nowhere, leaving behind only the silence of the steel. The metallic echo of the factory floor fades into the distance, replaced by the whispering winds of a different kind of wilderness. We leave the industrial shadows of Taiwan and travel to the rugged slopes of Mount Waryeong in South Korea. There, 5 boys would set out on a holiday afternoon, walking into a forest that would keep their secret for over a decade despite the efforts of an entire nation to bring them home. On the morning of March 26, 1991, the city of Daegu was alive with the hum of South Korea's first local elections in decades. It was a national holiday, a rare Tuesday off that felt like a gift to the school children of the Seongseo neighborhood. 5 young boys, ranging from 9 to 13 years old, gathered their plastic jars and ran toward the base of Mount Waryeong. Yu Chil-won, the oldest at 13, led the group with a natural authority that the younger boys never questioned. He was a bright student who loved the outdoors, often dragging his friends into the foothills to explore the hidden gullies and streams. To him, the mountain wasn't a wilderness but a backyard, a place where the rules of the classroom and the pressures of the city didn't apply. Beside him ran Cho Ho-yeon, 12, who was known for his infectious laugh and his collection of colorful marbles. He had promised his mother he would be back in time for lunch, his mind already set on the warm meal waiting at home. The boys were on a specific mission that day, to find salamander eggs in the cool shaded pools that formed after the spring rains. Kim Young-gyu, 11, carried the largest plastic container, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign of movement. He was a quiet child, the kind who noticed the small details that others missed, like the specific shape of a leaf or the sound of a distant bird. His parents described him as the glue of the group, always making sure no one fell too far behind as they climbed. Park Chan-in, 10, and Kim Jong-sik, 9, brought up the rear, their smaller legs working hard to keep pace with the older boys. Jong-sik was particularly excited, having told his father that morning that he was going to bring back the biggest catch of the day. They moved as a single unit, a pack of friends, fueled by the simple, pure joy of a holiday spent in the sun. The Songzio neighborhood was a place where everyone knew each other's names, and children played in the streets until the streetlights flickered on. Parents didn't worry about the mountain. It was a familiar landmark that stood guard over their homes. The boys were expected back by noon, their jars filled with the jelly-like eggs that were a staple of their childhood games. As the sun began to tilt toward the west, the festive atmosphere of the election day started to fade into the quiet of a late afternoon. In the Yu household, Chio-wan's mother set the table, expecting the familiar sound of the front door slamming and the boisterous chatter of her son. She looked at the clock, noting that lunch had long since passed, but figured the boys had simply lost track of time in the woods. By 4 o'clock, a subtle creeping anxiety began to ripple through the 5 households as mothers stepped out onto their porches to call for their sons. They met each other in the street, their forced smiles quickly disappearing when they realized that none of the boys had returned. The mountain, which had looked so welcoming in the morning light, now seemed vast and indifferent as the shadows lengthened. The fathers returned from the polling stations and immediately organized a search party carrying flashlights and calling out names into the deepening gloom. They combed the lower trails of Mount Waryong, their beams of light cutting through the brush, but the only response was the rustle of the wind. By midnight, the local police were notified, and the search for the Frog Boys began in earnest. The mountain was a maze of ridges and ravines, a place that could be deceptive to those who didn't know its hidden traps. The boys had been seen by a few witnesses near the foothills, but after 10 in the morning they seemed to have vanished into the earth itself. The initial search was frantic, driven by the hope that they had simply hosed down in a cave to stay warm. Sometimes a nation searches for a ghost while the truth is buried under its own feet. As the days turned into weeks, the disappearance of the 5 boys became a national obsession in South Korea. Their faces were printed on millions of milk cartons, cigarette packs, and candy wrappers, ensuring that every citizen from Seoul to Busan knew their names and their smiles. By 1995, the search had reached a fever pitch that was unprecedented in the history of the country. The president deployed over 300,000 police and military personnel to scour Mount Waryong and the surrounding provinces. They used sonar heat-seeking cameras and thousands of volunteers who walked shoulder to shoulder poking the ground with long metal poles. You feel the damp, heavy soil beneath your boots as you step through the thick brush, the same ground that has been searched 500 times before. Every rock is turned, every gully is mapped, and every cave is explored until the mountain is practically stripped of its secrets. Yet after 4 years of intensive, relentless labor, not a single shoe or plastic jar is ever recovered. The families of the boys spent their life savings on Frog Boy trucks covered in posters and loudspeakers and drove them across the peninsula. They followed every tip, no matter how outlandish, visiting psychics and remote villages in a desperate attempt to find a lead. The grief was a physical weight, a slow-motion catastrophe that played out on national television for years. The investigation was plagued by rumors and false leads ranging from North Korean abductions to mass runaways. The police, under immense pressure to provide answers, often chased shadows while the actual evidence sat undisturbed just a few kilometers from the boys' homes. It was a failure of forensic imagination that would haunt the South Korean justice system for decades to come. In September 2002, 11 years after the boys disappeared, a hiker was foraging for acorns in a remote gully on the mountain. He spotted a piece of rotted clothing sticking out of a patch of loose soil and began to dig with his hands. He uncovered a small shoe, and then another followed by the huddled, intertwined remains of 5 children. The discovery sent shockwaves through the country, especially when it was revealed that the bodies were found in an area that had been cleared by search teams hundreds of times. The boys were lying in a tight circle, as if they had tried to keep each other warm in their final moments. Initially, the police claimed they had died of hypothermia, a theory that the families rejected with fierce anger. Just one more egg, then we go, Jong-sik might have thought as he reached into the shadows, never realizing that he was stepping into a trap. Forensic analysis at a top university later proved that 3 of the boys had suffered horrific skull trauma before they died. There were dozens of small, square-shaped holes hammered into their bones with an unknown industrial tool. Spent shell casings from a nearby military firing range were found scattered near the shallow grave, leading to theories of a cover-up. Some believed the boys had been accidentally shot during a drill and buried by soldiers, while others pointed to a serial killer who used the noise of the range to mask his crimes. The truth was as cold and hard as the mountain itself. The hypothermia claim was a desperate attempt by local authorities to avoid admitting they had missed a mass murder right under their noses. The precision of the wounds suggested a killer who was calm, deliberate, and perhaps intimately familiar with the terrain. No one was ever arrested, and the weapon used to create those square holes was never identified by any expert. As of April 2026, the case of the Frog Boys remains one of South Korea's most painful and enduring mysteries. The statute of limitations for the murders expired in 2006, meaning that even if the killer confessed today, he could never be prosecuted. The mountain is now a place of pilgrimage, where a permanent memorial stands to honor the 5 lost children. The neighborhood in Daegu has changed, but the families still live with the echoes of that Tuesday in 1991. The jars they carried were never found, and the eggs they sought were long ago lost to the mud. It is a story of a search that was too big to see the small, tragic truth hidden in the shadows of the ridges. The silence of Mount Waryong is a heavy, suffocating thing, much like the air in the crowded townships of South Africa. We leave the mist-covered slopes of Daegu and travel to the sun-scorched plains of Cape Town. There, another predator was moving through the crowds of a train station, leaving a trail of sleeping children that would spark a different kind of national crisis. In the late afternoon of October 1994, 10-year-old Elroy Van Rooyen walked toward the Mitchell's Plain train station in Cape Town. The wind carried the sharp scent of salt from the Atlantic and the faint, oily smell of diesel from the idling locomotives. He was a small boy with a quick smile, clutching a few coins for his fare and a small bag of sweets he had bought for his younger brother. The Cape Flats was a place of high hopes and hard edges, especially in the mid-90s, as South Africa was reinventing itself. Families lived in small, crowded houses where the sound of the neighbor's radio was as familiar as their own. Elroy was a child of this transition, a boy who dreamed of becoming a teacher and spent his evenings practicing his handwriting by the light of a single bulb. He was known for being helpful, often carrying groceries for the elderly women in his block, just for a thank you and a pat on the head. His mother worked long hours at a textile factory, and Elroy took pride in his role as the protector of his siblings, making sure they were fed. To him, the train station wasn't a place of danger, but a gateway to a world of possibilities and new beginnings. Just a few more minutes until the train comes, and then I'll be home, Elroy might have thought as he stood on the crowded platform. He watched the commuters, men and women in dusty work clothes, all rushing toward the promise of a warm meal and a night of rest. He felt the vibration of the tracks through his thin-soled shoes, a rhythmic humming that usually signaled safety and progress. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, Elroy did not step off the train at his usual stop. His mother stood at the gate of their small garden, her eyes scanning the street for the familiar bobbing of his head in the crowd. Every minute that passed without the sound of his laughter felt like a brick being added to a wall of silence. The neighborhood was a place where children were the pulse of the streets, their games and shouts providing a constant backdrop to daily life. When a child didn't come home, the entire community felt the skip in the heartbeat. By midnight, groups of men were walking the railway lines with flashlights, their voices echoing off the concrete walls as they called out into the dark. Between 1986 and 1994, a shadow had been stretching across the railway lines of the Western Cape. Boys would leave for school or a local shop and simply never arrive at their destination, leaving behind nothing but an empty space in their families' lives. There was no noise, no struggle, just a sudden and absolute absence that left the police searching for a ghost. When the boys were eventually found, it was never in a way that suggested a frantic or messy struggle. They were discovered in the tall yellow grass of the dunes or near the edges of the tracks, often arranged in a peaceful, side-lying position. Their hands were tied behind their backs with specific tight knots, but their faces looked calm, as if they had merely laid down to rest in the middle of a walk. The discovery of Elroy Van Rooyen's body a few days later followed this same haunting pattern, bringing the total number of victims to 22. He was lying in a sandy clearing, his bag of sweets still tucked into his pocket, his small frame looking far too still against the vibrant green of the brush. The sight of a child posed like a sleeping angel is a horror that no amount of forensic training can truly prepare you for. The police were under immense pressure, operating in a country that was shedding its old skin and desperate for a victory over a monster. The media gave the killer a name that stuck like a curse: the station strangler. Every officer in the city was looking for a predator who could move through a crowded station without being noticed. A man who knew exactly how to blend into the chaos of the crowd. In 1995, the investigation centered on a local primary school teacher named Norman Simons. He was a well-liked man, respected in the community, and known for his quiet, polite demeanor and his dedication to his students. When he was arrested for the murder of Elroy, the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing the nightmare had finally been put to a permanent end. Sometimes justice is just a bandage for a wound that is still bleeding. During the trial, the evidence for Elroy's death seemed solid, with witnesses placing Simons near the station and forensic links to the boy's clothing. But as the defense dug into the other 21 murders, a terrifying inconsistency began to emerge from the medical lab reports that had been gathered over the previous 8 years. Advanced DNA testing, which was just becoming a standard tool for the Cape Town police, revealed a truth that no one was prepared to hear. The biological evidence found on the other 21 victims did not match the man sitting in the prisoner's dock. While Simons was being charged as the station strangler, the science suggested that he was likely only responsible for the death of the final boy. This meant that the predator, who had systematically hunted 21 children over nearly a decade, was still walking among them. He was a man who knew the rhythms of the trains, the layout of the dunes, and how to pose a body to look like it was dreaming. The conviction of Simons allowed the government to close the books, but it didn't stop the cold wind from blowing through the flats. As of April 2026, the case of the 21 other boys remains officially unsolved and cold. Norman Simons was granted parole in 2023, a move that reopened the deep, jagged wounds of the Cape Flats community. The police files for many of the victims were largely lost or destroyed during the political turmoil of the late 90s, making a new investigation nearly impossible. The families still visit the dunes where their sons were found, placing small stones and flowers in the sand. They live with the knowledge that the man who tied those specific knots and posed their children in the grass was never caught. The sleeping boys of Cape Town remain a silent testament to a period of history where the truth was often sacrificed for the sake of a convenient ending. The peaceful posed silence of the boys in the dunes is a quiet horror that finds an echo in a very different kind of space. We move now from the sun-drenched plains of South Africa to the freezing concrete heart of Moscow. In a suburban garage, a hidden lift leads down to a place where the silence was engineered and where a child's toy was the only witness to an industrial-scale disappearance. On a biting Tuesday morning in November 1996, a young Moscow police officer named Victor pulled his collar tight against the freezing wind. He was part of a small task force assigned to investigate a string of luxury car thefts that had been plaguing the northern suburbs of the city. To Victor, this was supposed to be a routine day of searching grease-stained garages and checking engine numbers against stolen records. The 1990s in Russia were a period of lawless transition, often referred to as the Wild East, where the old Soviet structures had collapsed and a new, brutal, organized crime element had risen in their place. Victor walked through the rows of corrugated iron garages, his boots crunching on the frozen slush and blackened ice. Most of these units were filled with rusting ladas, or piles of discarded tires smelling of old oil and damp concrete. He stopped in front of garage number 42, a unit that appeared better maintained than its neighbors, with a heavy steel door and a new, expensive-looking padlock. His information suggested that this was a primary storage site for a ring that specialized in high-end Western sedans. Victor signaled to his partner, and they used a heavy pair of bolt cutters to snap the lock, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet morning. Inside the garage was surprisingly clean and lit by a row of bright fluorescent tubes that flickered with a cold, buzzing intensity. There were no cars, only a few empty cardboard boxes, and a workbench neatly lined with professional-grade tools. Victor noticed a faint, rhythmic thrumming sound coming from beneath the floorboards, a vibration that felt more like heavy machinery than a simple heater or a plumbing issue. As he moved a stack of empty crates near the back wall, Victor spotted a small recessed control panel hidden behind a loose sheet of plywood. It looked like something out of a modern office building, with a series of digital buttons and a heavy-duty hydraulic switch. He felt a sudden, sharp prickle of unease, realizing that this wasn't a place for repairing cars, but a portal into something much deeper and more permanent. He pressed the switch, and the floor in the center of the garage began to descend with a low mechanical moan that vibrated through the soles of his boots. You feel the cold air from below rushing up to meet you, carrying a sharp chemical scent that burns the back of your throat. As the platform lowers, the gray light of the garage is replaced by the stark, sterile white of a subterranean concrete bunker. The lift came to a stop in a small hallway that felt more like a recording studio than a basement, with walls covered in thick, soundproof padding. Victor stepped off the platform, his hand resting on the grip of his service pistol as he followed the sound of a heavy industrial fan. The silence of the bunker was absolute engineered to ensure that no sound from the surface could ever reach this level, and no sound from here would ever escape. At the end of the hallway, he pushed open a heavy steel door and found himself in a room that looked like a surgical theater designed by a nightmare. In the center of the floor, a heavy iron chair was bolted directly into the concrete, fitted with leather straps and reinforced steel cuffs. The room was illuminated by high-intensity lamps that cast long, sharp shadows across the floor, highlighting a series of plastic vats lined up against the wall. The vats were filled with a thick, translucent slurry that simmered with a faint chemical heat, emitting a vapor that made Victor's eyes water. He approached the nearest container and saw fragments of white material floating in the liquid, slowly dissolving into the acidic bath. It didn't take long for the young officer to realize that these weren't industrial supplies, but the chemical remains of at least 5 men who had been effectively erased from existence. In a city where everything was for sale, some people paid with the only thing they had left, their absolute absence. Victor felt a wave of nausea hit him as he noticed the professional-grade ventilation system designed to pull the scent of decomposition away from the street level. This wasn't a crime of passion or a sudden outburst of violence. It was an industrial-scale liquidation point, a place where people were processed like raw materials. In the corner of the execution room, sitting on a small wooden stool, was a child's stuffed toy, a white rabbit with long floppy ears and a pink ribbon. It looked jarringly clean and innocent against the backdrop of the iron chair and the plastic vats, its button eyes staring blankly at the far wall. This toy would eventually give the bunker its name in the police files, a chilling contrast to the calculated cruelty that had occurred in the room. Victor found a series of ledgers in a small office adjacent to the main chamber, containing lists of names and dates written in a precise, businesslike hand. There were no notes about motives or crimes, only a column of figures representing payments made for services rendered. The victims were likely rival gang members or high-profile targets of the Solntsevskaya Bratva, the most powerful criminal organization in Moscow at the time. The investigation revealed that the garage had been leased to a series of shell companies, all of which disappeared within hours of the police discovery. The owners of the unit had vanished into the vast, lawless expanse of the Russian interior, leaving behind a facility that was as efficient as it was horrifying. Despite the ledgers, the acid had worked so thoroughly that DNA profiling in 1996 could not identify a single one of the victims. The White Rabbit bunker was a testament to the cold industrial nature of the Russian underworld, where the value of a human life was measured only by the cost of the chemicals needed to dissolve it. The soundproofing, and the hidden hydraulic lift suggested a level of engineering and investment that most police departments couldn't match. It was a dark mirror of the city's rapid modernization, a place where the shadows were as high-tech as the skyscrapers. Forensic experts spent weeks in the bunker sifting through the slurry to find any piece of evidence that could withstand the acid, like gold dental fillings or titanium surgical pins. They found very little, as the killers had been meticulous in their choice of industrial-strength solvents. The victims had been turned into an anonymous gray sludge, their families left to wonder for decades why their loved ones never came home from a simple meeting or a lunch. "I wonder if they ever looked at the rabbit," Victor thought as he stood in the doorway, unable to look away from the stuffed toy's blank gaze. He felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of the emptiness of the place. A void where 5 distinct lives had been stripped of their names, their history, and their physical form. It was a level of erasure that felt more permanent than death, a complete deletion from the story of the world. The perpetrators of the White Rabbit massacre were never caught, as the Solntsevskaya organization possessed a level of political and social protection that made them untouchable. The ledgers were eventually lost or misplaced during a series of bureaucratic reshuffles in the late 90s, and the investigation was quietly closed for lack of evidence. The bunker became a ghost story among the Moscow police, a reminder of the things that lived beneath the asphalt. As of April 2026, the northern suburb where garage number 42 once stood has been completely transformed. The row of iron garages was demolished in the early 2000s to make way for a high-end luxury apartment complex with a glass facade and a heated underground parking garage. The residents who park their expensive Western cars there every evening have no idea that they are sitting directly above the site of a mass execution chamber. The concrete was never truly removed, only buried under layers of new foundation and high-strength rebar. The White Rabbit bunker still exists, in a sense a hollow space in the earth that has been filled with the weight of a modern city. It remains a cold case in the archives of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, a silent record of 5 men who disappeared into a garage and never came out the other side. The stark, sterile white of the Moscow bunker is a sharp contrast to the chaotic, sun-drenched streets of a coastal city in China. We leave the cold silence of the Russian underground and travel to Beihai, where the air is thick with the scent of sea salt and the sounds of a bustling nursery. There, a different kind of predator was moving through the shadows of the afternoon nap, leaving behind a void that no amount of time could ever fill. Early afternoon in August 1995, inside the Red Sun Nursery in Beihai, a teacher named May was adjusting a long white laundry line in the courtyard. The sun was a heavy weight on the coastal city, making the air thick with the smell of sea salt and drying cotton. Every child was supposed to be in the middle of their mandatory afternoon nap, tucked into small wooden beds in the shaded dormitory. May had worked at the state-run facility for 5 years, and took pride in the rigid safety of the nursery's iron gates and high concrete walls. She hummed a quiet tune to herself, her hands moving rhythmically as she pinned damp sheets to the line. To her, the nursery was a fortress, a place where the children of hardworking families were shielded from the growing chaos of the rapidly modernizing city. One of those children was 4-year-old Liang, a boy with a stubborn cowlick and a habit of clutching a small wooden cicada his father had carved for him. Liang's parents were middle-class workers who saved every spare yuan for his education, dreaming of a future that didn't involve the factory floor. He was a quiet sleeper, usually the last one to wake up from the midday rest, his breathing slow and steady. Liang was the kind of child who noticed when a teacher was sad and would offer half of his afternoon snack without being asked. His mother often said his kindness was his greatest strength, but in a city as hungry as Beihai, it also felt like a vulnerability. She would kiss his forehead every morning at the gate, smelling the scent of milk and soap that seemed to cling to his hair. The dormitory was a long, cool room with high ceilings and rows of identical cots that smelled of laundry detergent and sleep. The only sound was the rhythmic whirring of the overhead fans, which struggled to move the humid air. It was the most peaceful hour of the day, a time when the world outside the nursery walls felt like it had been put on a temporary, respectful hold. When a system is built on absolute trust, a single crack can swallow everything. May felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to check on the boys' section, even though she was only halfway through her task. She wiped the sweat from her brow and stepped over the threshold, her eyes adjusting to the dim light of the interior. The rows of sleeping children looked like small, still islands in a sea of gray shadows. She walked toward the third cot from the window, which belonged to Liang, expecting to see the familiar curve of his back under the thin summer quilt. Instead, she saw a flat, unrumpled surface that looked as though it had never been occupied. The small wooden cicada sat alone on the pillow, its carved wings catching a stray beam of light from the courtyard. He must be under the bed playing a trick, May thought, her heart skipping a beat as she knelt on the hard floor to search the shadows. But the space beneath the bed was empty, save for a few dust motes dancing in the air. She checked the wardrobe, the bathroom, and the small storage closet, her movements growing more frantic and uncoordinated as the silence of the room began to feel suffocating. She ran back to the courtyard, the wet sheets slapping against her face as she searched the corners of the locked courtyard. The iron gates were still bolted from the inside, and the concrete walls were too high for a 4-year-old to climb. There were no signs of a struggle, no muddy footprints, and no noise other than the distant mocking sound of the waves hitting the harbor. Within the hour, the peace of the Red Sun nursery was replaced by a frantic screaming chaos as Liang's parents arrived at the gate. His mother collapsed onto the pavement, her hands clawing at the dirt as she shrieked her son's name into the hot afternoon air. The police arrived in green uniforms, their faces grim as they realized this was the 7th disappearance in Beihai in as many months. The city was gripped by a visceral, paralyzing panic that turned every neighbor into a suspect and every street corner into a threat. Parents began camping outside the schools, with heavy meat cleavers tucked into their belts, their eyes bloodshot from a lack of sleep. Rumors of a ghost kidnapper began to spread through the markets, a predator who could walk through walls and vanish with a child in the blink of an eye. The investigation revealed that each disappearance had occurred during the narrow window of the afternoon nap, always from high-security state-run nurseries. There was never any sign of forced entry, suggesting that the kidnapper didn't break in but was instead invited. The police began to focus on the small details that linked the victims, noting that all the children came from stable middle-class families. You stand in the quiet dormitory and notice a faint clinical smell lingering in the air like the scent of a hospital corridor. It is the smell of a specialized cleaning agent used by government health inspectors, a scent that shouldn't be present in the sleeping quarters during a nap. You realize that the scouts had been here days before, wearing official uniforms and carrying clipboards to map out the room's layout. The break in the case came when a local corrupt official was caught trying to alter the birth records of a child in a distant province. Under intense interrogation, he confessed to being part of a shadow network that facilitated the sale of abducted children to wealthy, childless families. The ring used fake health inspector credentials to gain access to the nurseries and identify the most desirable targets. The kidnappers had used a mild sedative sprayed onto the children's pillows to ensure they wouldn't wake up or cry out during the snatch. They would then simply carry the limp bodies out through the front gate in laundry baskets or equipment trunks, right past the oblivious guards. It was a terrifyingly efficient system that relied on the very bureaucracy meant to protect the citizens. In late 1995, the police raided a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, discovering a small group of children waiting to be transported. Among them were 2 of the 7 missing boys from Beihai, terrified and confused but alive. The ringleaders were arrested, and following a swift and public trial, were executed by the state to appease the boiling rage of the public. However, the victory was only partial, as 5 of the children, including young Liang, were never recovered. The trail of the buyers had been cold for months, and the records of where the children had been sent were systematically destroyed before the raid. The parents of the missing 5 were left with a grief that had no resolution, their lives frozen in the moment their children vanished. As of April 2026, 5 families in Beihai still maintain a bedroom for a child who would now be over 30 years old. They have submitted their DNA to national databases, hoping that a routine medical check or a marriage application will trigger a match. For them, the coastal wind of Beihai still carries the faint, haunting scent of drying laundry and the memory of a midday nap that never ended. The stolen children of the coastal city are a legacy of a system that failed its most vulnerable, leaving a silence that can never be filled. We leave the panicked streets of China now and travel to the ancient emerald heart of Borneo. In the rainforests of Sarawak, the air is thick with a different kind of disappearing act where the trees themselves seem to swallow those who dare to speak for the land. Early morning in October 1995, deep in the heart of the Sarawak rainforest, the air was a thick, emerald soup of humidity and the deafening shriek of cicadas. A man named Mutang, a seasoned hunter from the Penan tribe, crouched by a shallow stream, his eyes scanning the mud for the footprint of a wild boar. He was a man of the forest, a person who understood the language of the leaves and the secret paths that led through the dense rattan. Mutang was 40 years old, with skin the color of polished mahogany and legs as strong as the ironwood trees he spent his life protecting. He could navigate the primary jungle in total darkness, reading the map of the stars through the canopy and the scent of the damp earth beneath his feet. To him, the forest wasn't a resource to be exploited, but a living, breathing ancestor that provided everything his people needed to survive and thrive. His village was a cluster of stilt houses that seemed to float above the ferns, connected by narrow paths worn smooth by generations of bare feet. Life was measured in the ripening of wild fruit and the seasonal migration of the hornbills across the valley. Mutang spent his days teaching his sons how to carve blowpipes from hard bamboo and how to move through the brush without snapping a single twig or disturbing a bird. There was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself, a man who knew exactly where he belonged in the complex ecosystem of the Borneo interior. He was the bridge between the ancient traditions of the Penan and the encroaching, harsh reality of the modern world. His family felt a profound sense of safety whenever he was near, his presence as steady and reliable as the ancient flow of the Baram River through the hills. But by 1995, the sacred silence of the forest was being torn apart by the mechanical roar of bulldozers and the high-pitched whine of industrial chainsaws. Massive logging concessions had been granted to corporations with deep ties to the regional government, and the ancient trees were falling by the thousands every day. Mutang had become a leader in the resistance, organizing blockades on the dirt roads that cut through their lands. In November, Mutang received a handwritten message from a local logging camp manager, an invitation to a peace negotiation in a remote clearing. The manager promised that if the Penans stopped their protests, the company would respect the boundaries of their sacred hunting grounds. Despite the warnings from his elders, Mutang believed that a dialogue was the only way to save what remained of their home from the machines. He set out at dawn, carrying only his blowpipe and a small pouch of tobacco, promising his wife he would return before the evening mists rolled in. Witnesses from a nearby settlement reported seeing him walk into a small clearing where a military-style helicopter painted a dull olive green was idling. Two men in dark uniforms stepped out, and Mutang climbed aboard, his expression calm and determined as he vanished into the sky. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest began its nightly chorus of frogs and insects, Mutang's house remained dark and silent. His wife stood at the edge of the clearing, her eyes searching the shadows for the familiar silhouette of her husband returning from his meeting. She waited until the moon was high in the sky, her heart growing colder with every minute that passed without the sound of his footsteps on the path. The next morning, the men of the village set out to find him, retracing his steps to the negotiation clearing with the precision of master trackers. They found the grass flattened where the helicopter had landed, but there were no signs of a struggle or any discarded items. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed the hunter and the machine whole, leaving behind only the lingering smell of burnt aviation fuel. You feel the sharp prickle of the leeches on your ankles as you push through the dense rattan, your eyes searching for any scrap of cloth or broken branch. You know every inch of this terrain, yet there is a terrifying, unnatural void where a man's presence should be. You begin to realize that the forest didn't take him. It was the world outside that came in to erase him from the map. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the wilderness isn't the predator you can see, but the one that flies far above the canopy. As the days turned into weeks, more activists from the Kayan and Penan tribes began to vanish under similar mysterious circumstances. They were all expert survivalists, men who could live off the land for months at a time, yet they were disappearing in the span of a few hours. A few miles from the clearing, a search party found a single chilling piece of evidence hanging from the branch of a low-hanging orchid. It was Mutang's blowpipe snapped cleanly in half, and a shredded piece of the batik cloth he used as a sarong. There were no bloodstains, no footprints, and no trail to follow, just the broken tools of a life that had been systematically and coldly dismantled by an unknown force. Rumors began to filter back from the logging camps about sky burials where men were taken up in helicopters and dropped into the South China Sea. Others spoke of secret graves dug under the heavy concrete footings of the new logging roads where the bodies would be encased forever. The Malaysian police refused to enter the deep jungle to investigate, claiming the area was too dangerous due to insurgent activity. The disappearances were a calculated campaign of terror designed to decapitate the indigenous leadership and clear the way for the massive Bakun Dam project. Without their guides and spokesmen, the tribes were left vulnerable and disorganized, unable to navigate the legal and political labyrinths of the distant capital. The jungle, once their protector, was now a vast crime scene where the evidence was rapidly reclaimed by the rot. I wonder if he looked down at the trees one last time and realized they were the only witnesses to his final moments on Earth. Mutang's family never received a death certificate, a body, or even an official acknowledgement that he had ever been missing. In the eyes of the state, he simply didn't exist anymore, a ghost in a forest that was being erased and sold off alongside him. As of April 2026, the case of Mutang and the other disappeared activists remains a forgotten footnote in the history of Sarawak. Most of the primary rainforest where they fought has been replaced by endless uniform rows of oil palm plantations. No official missing persons files were ever opened, and no commission has ever been formed to find their remains or bring their killers to any form of justice. The humid silence of the Borneo jungle is a heavy weight, a stillness that carries the secrets of the dead into the roots of the earth. We leave the emerald canopy now and travel to the dry, dusty plains of Australia, where the trees are thinner and the shadows are longer. In the Belanglo State Forest, another hunter was moving through the brush, but his prey was not found in the wild. On a crisp afternoon in late December 1993, a group of local hunters moved through the thick, dry brush of the Belanglo State Forest. The air was heavy with the scent of eucalyptus and the dry scratching sound of cicadas that seemed to vibrate in the very bark of the trees. They were looking for feral pigs, but as they pushed into a remote gully, the lead hunter stopped, his eyes fixed on a patch of disturbed earth near a fallen log. Gabor Neugebauer was 21 years old, a young man from Germany who viewed the vast Australian landscape as a playground for his adventurous spirit. He was tall, with a steady gaze and a quiet confidence that made people trust him almost instantly. He spent his days planning routes through the outback, obsessed with the idea of seeing the rugged heart of the continent before returning to his studies in Munich. His girlfriend Anja Habshid was 20, a vibrant woman who balanced Gabor's seriousness with a quick, bright laugh. She kept a detailed journal of their travels, filling the pages with sketches of exotic birds and descriptions of the star-filled southern sky. They were frugal travelers, often hitchhiking or camping in remote spots to save money, believing that the kindness of strangers was a fundamental part of the journey. The couple had a routine that felt invincible in its simplicity, involving morning coffee over a small portable stove and long walks through national parks. They were experts at packing their lives into 2 large rucksacks, ensuring that everything they owned had a specific place and purpose. To Anja, the dusty roads of New South Wales represented a freedom they could never find in the crowded cities of Europe. In late December 1991, they stood on the side of the Hume Highway, their thumbs out and their hearts full of excitement for the next leg of their trip. They were looking for a ride toward Adelaide, expecting nothing more than a friendly conversation and a few hours of shared road. When a silver-blue 4-wheel drive pulled over, they climbed in, grateful for the air conditioning and the seemingly helpful man behind the wheel. The driver was a man who looked like he belonged to the land, with thick, calloused hands and a friendly, unremarkable smile. He talked about the best fishing spots and the hidden beauty of the state forests, his voice low and reassuring in the quiet cabin of the vehicle. Gabor and Anja settled into the plush seats, never noticing as the car turned off the main highway and began to head toward the dense, darkening woods. You feel the sudden jolt of the tires leaving the smooth asphalt for the rutted, uneven dirt of a logging trail. The trees begin to close in their long, spindly shadows stretching across the hood of the car like skeletal fingers reaching for the glass. The man in the driver's seat is no longer talking about fishing, and the quiet click of the child safety locks engaging is the only sound in the cabin. The hunters in 1993 didn't find a feral pig in that gully, but they found the corner of a colorful nylon sleeping bag sticking out of the dirt. As they brushed away the dry leaves, they uncovered a scene of such calculated brutality that it would change the Australian psyche forever. They had stumbled upon the final resting place of Gabor and Anja, buried in a shallow, rocky grave far from any marked trail. Forensic investigators arrived on the scene, their white suits standing out against the brown and gray of the forest floor as they began the delicate task of excavation. They found Gabor first, and the details of his death suggested a level of cruelty that felt almost ritualistic. He had been tied to a tree and used as target practice, with 6 bullet holes arranged in a precise, neat pattern around his head. "He was just making sure he hit the center," a detective muttered as he looked at the grouping of the shots. The killer hadn't just murdered Gabor. He had treated him like a piece of wood at a shooting range, cold and indifferent to his humanity. Each shot was fired from a Ruger 10-22 rifle, a weapon known for its accuracy and its devastatingly quiet report under the canopy of the trees. Anja's fate was even more horrific, revealing a predator who possessed a terrifying level of physical strength and a complete lack of mercy. She had been decapitated, but not with a single stroke. The forensic team found that her vertebrae had been severed with such force it looked like a professional butchery job. Despite a search that lasted for weeks and covered miles of rugged terrain, her head was never recovered. The investigation in 1995 focused on a specific site deep in the woods that the detectives began to call the killing seat. It was a fallen log positioned perfectly in front of a large, flat-trunked tree where the killer had set up his victims for his final act. The ground was littered with spent shell casings and cigarette butts, suggesting the perpetrator had spent a long time in the area savoring the control he held. "I think the forest was his cathedral, and he was its only god." The police began to realize they weren't looking for a drifter, but someone who knew every inch of Belanglo like it was his own backyard. They searched for a man who owned a very specific type of vehicle and a very specific type of rifle, eventually leading them to the door of a road worker named Ivan Milat. When the police raided Milat's home in 1994, they found a chilling museum of his crimes tucked away in the rafters and cupboards. They recovered Gabor's sleeping bag and Anja's camping stove items that Milat had brought home to use as everyday household goods. He wasn't just a killer. He was a scavenger who lived among the ghosts of the people he had hunted in the woods. The trial in 1995 and 96 laid bare the mechanics of the nightmare, describing how Milat would lure backpackers into his car with a mask of friendliness. He was a master of the long game, building trust over miles of highway before driving them into his private barrow. The court heard how he likely had an accomplice, possibly a family member who helped him subdue 2 fit young adults at the same time. Milat was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences, a legal finality that brought some small measure of peace to the families in Germany. He remained defiant throughout his imprisonment, refusing to admit to his crimes or reveal the location of Anja's head. He seemed to enjoy the secret power he held over the living, a predator who refused to surrender his final trophy, even as his own life began to fade. As of April 2026, Belanglo State Forest remains a place of dark pilgrimage and haunting memory for the people of New South Wales. Ivan Milat died of cancer in prison in 2019, taking the final secrets of his victims to his grave. Modern forensic teams still occasionally return to the forest with ground-penetrating radar searching for the other angels who might still be hidden in the rocky soil. The case is officially closed, but the shadow of the backpacker murders continues to loom over the Australian outback. The campsite from hell has been reclaimed by the brush, but the scars on the trees from the target practice are still visible if you know where to look. It is a story of a beautiful dream that was cut short by a man who saw the world as nothing more than a bison. The dry, scratching heat of the Australian forest eventually fades into a different kind of silence, one that is damp and heavy with the smell of old stone. We leave the dusty trails of Belanglo and travel to the gray, rain-slicked streets of Belgium. In the town of Charleroi, a man was building a different kind of cage, one that was hidden behind the heavy shelves of a normal family home. On the afternoon of June 24th, 1995, a warm sun hung over the quiet streets of Grace Hallan, a suburb near Liège, Belgium. 8-year-old Julie Lejeune stood on her sidewalk, squinting against the brightness, while she waited for her best friend to cross the street. She was a child who saw the world in vibrant colors, often spending her afternoons filling sketchbooks with drawings of tall trees and smiling families. Her friend Melissa Russo, also 8, was the quiet one of the pair, possessing a shy smile that only appeared when she felt completely safe. Melissa carried a small bag of snacks and a toy, her mind set on the afternoon of play they had planned for weeks. Their friendship was a simple, unbreakable bond built on shared secrets and the easy rhythms of a neighborhood where everyone knew each other's names. The girls decided to walk toward a nearby bridge to wave at the passing cars, a favorite pastime that felt like a grand adventure to their young minds. Julie led the way, her sandals slapping softly against the warm pavement, while Melissa followed a few steps behind, humming a song. They were children of a peaceful era, living in a place where the biggest worry was usually a scraped knee or a lost toy. Julie's parents expected her back for dinner by 6, a rule that was rarely broken because she hated to miss the family meal. Her father, Jean Denis, sat in the living room listening to the radio and waiting for the sound of the front door clicking open. He valued the predictable safety of their routine, a comfort that allowed him to believe that the world was a fundamentally kind place for a little girl to grow up. Melissa's mother was already preparing a small treat for the girls, the scent of baking bread filling her kitchen with a sense of domestic peace. She looked at the clock and noticed it was 5:30, figuring the girls would be rounding the corner any minute now. There was a specific lightness to the air that afternoon, the kind of perfect summer day that usually ends with tired feet and happy memories. But as the clock ticked past 6 and then 6:30, the silence in the neighborhood began to feel heavy and unnatural. Jean Denis stepped out onto his porch, his eyes scanning the long, empty stretch of road that led toward the bridge. He called Julie's name, his voice echoing off the brick houses, but the only response was the distant hum of a lawnmower a few streets over. Within the hour, both families were out in the streets, their initial concern quickly sharpening into a cold, jagged panic. They retraced the path to the bridge, searching the tall grass and the edges of the woods, their flashlights cutting through the deepening twilight. The bridge stood silent and indifferent, offering no clue as to where 2 small girls could have vanished in the span of a single afternoon. The Belgian police were notified, but their initial response was slow, hampered by a bureaucratic system that often treated missing children as runaways. The investigators focused on the families first, a standard procedure that felt like a betrayal to the grieving parents. Days turned into weeks, and the vibrant drawings on Julie's desk began to gather a thin layer of dust as the house fell into a permanent grieving silence. During that year of silence, a man named Marc Dutroux was living in a cluttered, unremarkable house in the industrial city of Charleroi. He was a convicted predator who had been released early from prison, despite warnings from psychologists that he remained a high risk to the public. He moved through the city in a battered white van, a shadow that the authorities chose to ignore, even as the list of missing girls began to grow. The house in Charleroi was a labyrinth of damp hallways and peeling wallpaper, smelling of stale cigarettes and old wood. Neighbors reported seeing Dutroux carrying heavy bags of concrete and wood into the basement at odd hours of the night. However, the local police, who were supposed to be monitoring him, never bothered to step inside the threshold to see what he was building beneath the floorboards. In the basement, behind a heavy floor-to-ceiling shelf filled with old tools and discarded paint cans, Dutroux had engineered a secret. He had carved out a tiny soundproofed cell made of reinforced concrete barely large enough for 2 people to stand in. It was a space designed for total erasure, a windowless box where the sounds of the outside world were replaced by the rhythmic thumping of a ventilation fan. In December of 1995, while Julie and Melissa were still missing, Dutroux was arrested for an unrelated car theft and sent to jail for several months. He left his wife, Michelle Martin, in charge of the house, giving her strict instructions to look after the cargo hidden behind the shelf. Martin was a woman who lived in a state of quiet, subservient fear, a willing participant in the darkness her husband created. Sometimes a person chooses to look at a closed door and pretend they hear nothing but the wind. While Dutroux sat in a prison cell, Julie and Melissa were trapped in the blackness of the cellar, their world reduced to a few square feet of cold concrete. They were only a few miles away from a city full of people, yet they were as isolated as if they had been dropped into the furthest reaches of space. Michelle Martin later claimed she was too afraid to enter the cellar or alert the police while her husband was away. She continued to live her life in the rooms above, cooking meals and watching television, while the two 8-year-olds slowly succumbed to the cold and the lack of food. The silence from beneath the floorboards eventually became absolute, a secret that Martin kept even as the police visited the house for routine checks. In August of 1996, following the abduction of 2 more teenagers, the Belgian authorities finally launched a massive, desperate raid on Dutroux's properties. They moved the heavy shelf in the Charleroi basement and found a small hidden lever that opened the secret door. 2 girls, Sabine and Letitia, were found alive in the cell, their faces pale and their eyes wide, with a terror that would never truly leave them. You stand in that cramped, airless box and realize that the walls are covered in the faint, desperate scratches of children who had no other way to speak. The air is stagnant, smelling of unwashed bodies and the metallic tang of fear that has soaked into the very concrete. It is a place where time ceased to exist, a physical manifestation of a man's desire to own and destroy the innocence of others. The investigation soon led the police to another of Dutroux's properties in Sars-la-Buissière, a house with a large, overgrown garden. Under a tool shed that had been recently moved, they began to dig into the heavy clay soil. After several hours, they uncovered the remains of Julie and Melissa buried deep beneath a layer of quicklime and concrete that had been meant to hide them forever. The discovery of the bodies sent a shockwave through Belgium that quickly turned into a national revolution against the state. 300,000 citizens took to the streets in the White March, carrying white balloons and flowers to protest the incompetence of the judicial system. They demanded to know how a known monster could operate so freely while the lives of their children were being traded in the shadows. I believe the most haunting part of this story isn't the man, but the shelf that stood between the girls and their rescue for over a year. It was a simple object of wood and metal, yet it served as a wall that even the most advanced police force in the country failed to look behind. The silence of that house is a weight that the nation of Belgium still carries in its collective memory. Marc Dutroux was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a conviction that offered a small measure of legal finality. During his trial, theories emerged about a larger network of high-level figures who protected him, but the official narrative remained focused on him as an isolated predator. Many witnesses associated with the case died under mysterious circumstances before they could ever take the stand. As of April 2026, Marc Dutroux remains in a high-security prison now, an old man whose name is still spoken with a shudder across Europe. His wife, Michelle Martin, was released on parole in 2012, a decision that sparked renewed outrage and protests across the country. She lives a quiet, secluded life in a convent far from the city where the shelf once stood. The houses owned by Dutroux, including the one in Charleroi, have been systematically demolished by the government to prevent them from becoming shrines to his crimes. In their place, the cities have built small memorial gardens filled with white flowers and benches for quiet reflection. They are spaces designed to reclaim the land from the darkness, though the soil beneath will always hold the memory of what was lost. Julie and Melissa never got to finish their drawings or wave at the cars from the bridge again. Their story is a cold reminder of the gaps that exist in our systems of protection and the absolute fragility of a normal afternoon. The silence of the Belgian basement has been replaced by the rustle of the wind through the memorial, leaves a quiet, heavy doom of the Black March. The shadow of the bridge and the shelf fades now, leaving behind a world that is a little more watchful and a lot less certain. We have traveled from the parks of Tokyo to the forests of Australia, and finally to the hidden cells of Belgium, finding that the darkness is always the same, regardless of the language it speaks. Now it is time to return to the quiet of your own room, where the only sound is the rain. The rain has settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse against the window pane, a sound that seems to push the rest of the world away until only this room and these stories remain. We have traveled across continents and through the heavy, humid air of a decade that felt like a bridge between the old world and the one we live in now. The 90s were a time of transition, a period where the shadows were still deep enough to swallow lives whole before the glow of a billion screens began to track our every movement. It is a heavy thing to carry 11 lives in your mind at this hour of the night, to think of the architects and the children and the hunters who never made it back to the warmth of their own beds. We often look at the past through a lens of nostalgia, remembering the music or the colors, but we forget the silence that existed in the gaps. These stories are the records of those gaps, the moments where the systems we trusted simply failed to see the tragedy unfolding right in front of them. Think back to the architect in Tokyo, a man whose entire existence was defined by the precision of a blueprint, only to be reduced to a series of measurements that fit a trash can. Or the man in the leather trunk on the German motorway, a ghost in a designer suit who had been so thoroughly erased that even his clothes lacked a name. These were people who moved through the world with purpose and status, yet they found themselves trapped in a logic that was as cold and unfeeling as a machine. There is a specific kind of chill that comes from realizing how fragile our sense of security really is, how easily a normal afternoon can be dismantled by a single wrong turn. The grandmother in Romania, surrounded by the sweet scent of her linden honey, had no reason to fear the darkness of her own cellar. She lived in a world where the primary threats were thought to be ancient legends, never suspecting that a modern predator could use the tools of science to perform an act of ancient cruelty. We find ourselves haunted by the image of the three workers in Taiwan, stepping into a steel vat and vanishing as if they had simply walked through the metal itself. Or the 5 boys in South Korea whose laughter was silenced on a mountain that was searched by an entire nation for over a decade. These cases remind us that the truth is often sitting right beneath our feet, waiting for the years to pass and the soil to shift before it finally decides to reveal its jagged, painful edges. The stories of the children are perhaps the hardest to hold, the ones that linger long after the audio ends and the lights are turned out. The sleeping boys in the dunes of Cape Town and the stolen children from the nurseries of Beihai represent a void that no amount of time can ever truly fill for their families. They were taken during the most vulnerable moments of their lives, during a nap or a walk to a station, reminding us that the predator often waits in the spaces we consider most sacred. In the frozen suburbs of Moscow, a child's white rabbit sat as a silent witness to a bunker where men were turned into a chemical gray sludge. And in the deep, emerald heart of the Borneo rainforest, the trees themselves were used to hide the disappearance of men who only wanted to protect their ancestral home. These were industrial-scale erasures, acts of violence that were committed with the cold efficiency of a business transaction where the human cost was just a figure on a ledger. Then there are the forests of Australia and the basements of Belgium, places where the horror was hidden behind a smile or a heavy wooden shelf. The backpackers in Belanglo and the little girls in Charleroi were victims of men who understood how to use the landscape and the architecture of a normal life to create a private world of suffering. They proved that the most terrifying monsters don't live under the bed, they live next door. They offer us rides, and they build their cages in plain sight. As you sit in the quiet of your own home tonight, take a moment to listen to the sounds that you usually ignore. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of a floorboard, the wind in the eaves. These are the textures of a life that is safe, the mundane details that we often complain about but would miss with a desperate intensity if they were ever taken away. The victims in these stories would have given anything for one more boring afternoon, one more routine commute, or one more simple meal. The lesson we carry away from these shadows is not one of paralyzing fear, but of a sharpened awareness for the world around us and the people we love. It is a reminder to trust that small nagging voice in the back of your mind that tells you a situation feels wrong, even if you can't explain why. Our intuition is an ancient tool, a gift that has kept our species alive through countless winters and through the predatory darkness that has always walked beside us. We also learn the importance of names and the weight of a person's history, the things that keep us from becoming just another unidentified file in a police archive. Every person we have spoken of tonight was more than just a victim. They were architects of their own dreams, children with favorite toys, and leaders with a vision for their people. By remembering them, by saying their names in the quiet of the night, we pull them back from the absolute erasure that their killers intended for them. There is a profound irony in the fact that we use technology today to listen to stories of a time when the lack of technology allowed these tragedies to stay hidden for so long. We live in an era where it is harder to disappear, yet the fundamental darkness of the human heart has not changed in the 3 decades since these events. The tools have evolved, the world has grown smaller, but the gaps in our safety are still there, waiting for the moment we decide to stop paying attention. I think the reason we are drawn to these tales is not because we enjoy the darkness, but because we are searching for the light that exists in the resilience of the families who never stopped looking. Their persistence is the ultimate defiance against the killers who wanted to turn their loved ones into ghosts. Whether it is a father driving a truck across Korea or a family in China submitting their DNA to a database, their hope is a flame that the wind of the 90s could never quite blow out. As the rain continues to fall, let the weight of these stories settle into a sense of gratitude for the locks on your doors and the people who are sleeping in the rooms down the hall. We have walked through the ruins of many lives tonight, but we have the privilege of returning to our own reality, a world that is still full of color and noise, and the possibility of a tomorrow. The shadows are part of the landscape, but they do not have to be the whole story of who we are. The 90s have left us with many questions that may never be answered, secrets that are buried under concrete or hidden in the depths of a forest that has long since been cleared. We accept the mystery as part of the human condition, a reminder that we are not the masters of everything we see and that some doors are better left closed. But even as we close the book on these 11 cases, we carry the memory of the victims with us, a silent vow to not let their names be forgotten. The silence of the room is no longer a void, but a space filled with the echoes of the journeys we have taken together through the Tokyo parks and the Romanian villages. It is a space where we can acknowledge the cold, hard facts of the world while still holding on to the warmth of our own empathy and our shared humanity. The darkness only wins when we turn away from the truth, when we decide that the lives of others are too heavy or too strange to be worth our attention. We have come to the end of our journey for tonight, a long walk through the cold gray morning of a decade that refused to give up its secrets without a fight. The white noise of the rain is a perfect backdrop for the thoughts that are likely swirling in your mind, a cleansing sound that washes away the grit and the grime of the crime scenes. It is time to let the tension go, to relax your shoulders, and to let the stillness of the night take over your senses. If you have found a sense of connection in these stories, if you feel the weight of the names we have spoken, I would be honored if you stayed a part of this community. You can subscribe to keep these nighttime conversations going, and if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment about which of these 11 lives stayed with you the most. Your presence here turns a lonely broadcast into a shared experience, a way for us all to face the darkness together and come out on the other side. The streetlights outside are flickering, casting long orange glows across the wet pavement, a signal that the night is at its deepest and most honest point. It is the hour where we are most aware of our own mortality, and most thankful for the simple, uncomplicated safety of a warm blanket and a quiet room. Take that feeling with you into your sleep, a small glowing coal of comfort that will burn steadily until the sun comes up to chase the shadows away once again. The stories of the architect, the grandmother, the children, and the activists are now a part of your own memory, a thread that connects you to the history of a world that is often cruel, but never entirely without hope. We honor them by living our own lives with a bit more intention, a bit more kindness, and a lot more awareness of the precious, fragile nature of every second we are given. The night is long, but it is not infinite, and the dawn is never as far away as it seems. Check the stove one last time, make sure the windows are latched against the damp air, and let the quiet of the night be your guide into a deep, dreamless sleep. You have done the hard work of listening, of bearing witness to the things that happen in the dark, and now it is time to find your own peace. The world will still be there in the morning, but for now there is only the soft whisper of the rain and the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing. Good night, and remember that even in the most silent basement or the deepest forest, The truth has a way of breathing, waiting for the right moment to be heard. We will be here again when the sun goes down, ready to walk the paths that others have forgotten and to find the humanity hidden in the cold cases of the past. Until then, keep your light burning bright and your heart open to the stories that the world is trying to tell you in the quiet moments. Sleep well knowing that you are not alone in the dark and that the shadows are just a part of the light that we are all trying to find together. The journey is long, but the company is good, and the stories are the maps that show us how far we have come and how much we have left to protect. The rain is slowing down now, leaving a fresh, clean world in its wake, and the night is finally ready to let you go into the comfort of your dreams. One last look at the empty street, one last deep breath of the cool nighttime air, and then it is time to turn off the final lamp. The silence is yours now, a gift that you have earned by walking through the fire of these 11 lives and coming out on the other side with your empathy intact. We will speak again soon, but for now, let the darkness be a soft, quiet blanket that holds you safe until the world wakes up again. Good night.